Founding Fathers said the judiciary is the weakest, is to be controlled by the other two. They said that judges do not have lifetime appointments. They specifically said we do not have three independent branches.
The legal interpretations of the Supreme Court have become the final determiner in the policies that affect the daily lives of American citizens.
Since when did we allow the opinion of the majority of 9 individuals to become the equal of law?
Are all branches of the government created equal?
There was no branch that was unaccountable to the people. That's why the Constitution up top says, we the people.
Does the Supreme Court now wield more power than our Founding Fathers ever intended? Discover our nation's godly history in the American Heritage series. America, this is your heritage.
In America, we've had a Constitution for more than 2 centuries. We still operate under that Constitution. We still have our 3 branches of government that are assigned by that Constitution. And if the Founding Fathers were to come back today to see what it looked like 2 centuries later, what we did, what does it look like now? They would recognize the presidency. They would recognize the congressional side. They would scratch their head at the judiciary and say, who are these guys? Where do they come from? Where do they get these powers you're talking about? They would be absolutely floored to see what we have done with the judiciary today, or really allowed the judiciary to do, when they gave us such explicit writings back in the beginning that were exactly on the other side.
Wow.
There's at least 5 judicial myths that we widely buy today that they would say, well, wait a minute, we wrote this all down so you would know better.
Explain in kind of layman's terms the judiciary. What does that encompass? Who are these people? Where do they come from? What do they do?
You have judiciary that occurs actually at 2 levels. You have federal judiciary, you have a state judiciary. At the federal judiciary, all judges are appointed by the President, confirmed by the U.S. Senate. At the state judiciary, some states have judges appointed by the governor, confirmed by the Senate. More than half the states elect the judges that serve in the judiciary. You have levels of judiciary. You will have the Supreme Court, you'll have the Court of Appeals, and you'll have a district court. And that exists in both the state side and the federal side. So you have a bunch of lower level judges. What they do can be appealed to the Court of Appeals level. Much fewer there, maybe 8 to 10% of the number. And then from there that can get appealed to the Supreme Court, either the state or the United States. So that's generally the structure of judiciary. And it's gotten to be now where that we use the judiciary as a policy-making body. If we don't like what the state legislature did, we'll go, it's called forum shopping. We'll go find a judge that we know doesn't like what they did, and we'll file a suit in his court so he'll strike it down. And so now it's gotten to where legal groups use the judges as an alternative legislature. If 90% of the people want something, the legislature passes it, and the 10% couldn't win in the legislature, they go try to win at the courts. So to say that that's the only source of justice, and that's a self-policing body, that's not good, that's not right, and it is not what the Constitution authorized. And that's where we get these 5 judicial myths. Interestingly, the locations in which the Supreme Court met during its first century and a half form a potent commentary on the founders' views of the power and the reach of the Supreme Court. Our founders made remarkably elaborate plans for the city of Washington, D.C. Our founders planned for traffic, they anticipated growth, they made far-sighted preparations for the President and the Congress, and they provided buildings and support services for both. Yet with all of their elaborate preparations, they did not provide a separate building for the U.S. Supreme Court. And this was not an oversight on their part. It was intentional. The Supreme Court met inside the Capitol. In the first 10 years in this building, the court bounced around from location to location, from various committee rooms to library rooms to whatever was available. Then in 1810, when the Senate left its original chambers and moved directly upstairs to its newer and larger second location, the Supreme Court inherited these vacated Senate chambers. It was here, in the basement of the U.S. Senate, that the Supreme Court finally found its first permanent home, a location it kept for the next 50 years. Then, when the Senate vacated the old Senate chambers and moved into its current home, the Supreme Court moved upstairs to possess the again vacated Senate chambers. It was by design that the Supreme Court had no major role in shaping policy in the nation. Simply look at the Constitution for proof. Article 1 deals with the powers of the Congress. Article 2 with the powers of the President, and Article 3 with the powers of the Supreme Court. Article 1 is by far the longest of those three articles, and Article 3 is unquestionably the shortest. For the first 10 years of its existence, the entire Supreme Court term lasted less than 2 weeks out of each year. And for the next 50 years, the court still only met for 6 to 8 weeks a year. It was not until 1935, nearly a century and a half after the founders had written the Constitution, that a separate building was built behind the Capitol to house the Supreme Court, the home it now occupies. And it was not until 2 decades after this, in 1956, that under the guidance of its activist Chief Justice, Earl Warren, the Supreme Court first began to meet for nearly 9 months out of each year, a practice which still continues today. First off, we're told the three branches are co-equal. Founding Fathers said absolutely not. You have to remember that the Founding Fathers did the Constitution 11 years after they did the Declaration. The Declaration set forth their reasons for separating from Great Britain. So, in their reasons, when they say, for example, we don't want taxation without representation, they come over here 11 years later and they say, now in the legislature, you cannot create any tax that does not go through the legislature. And by the way, it can't come out of the Senate. It has to come out of the House of Representatives, because that's the body closest to the people.
Correct.
So everything they raised in the Declaration, they solved in the Constitution. In the Declaration, they raised 4 clauses that dealt with judicial abuses. They said, we're having real trouble with British judges. We have judicial activism with these British judges. 11 years later, they solved it in the Constitution. Now, the 2 things that they complained the most about with British judges, and this started with Sam Adams in 1765. Samuel Adams was one of the leaders in this. He said, 2 problems with the British judiciary. One is their judges have lifetime appointments. 2, their judges are unaccountable to the people. What we have is King George III appoints them, and they make rulings against our legislatures all the time, and we can't do anything about it because they're appointed by the king, not by us. We got no recourse. On top of that, he pays their salary. We don't.
Wow.
We don't have any way of touching these judges. So the 2 big complaints Americans had about the British judicial system was lifetime appointments and unaccountable judges. And so you're going to tell me that being the 2 biggest complaints, they gave us the Constitution that's going to allow lifetime appointments and going to allow unaccountable judges? No. When they got to the Constitution, they gave us 6 clauses that enabled Congress to keep judges from having lifetime appointments, 6 clauses that enabled Congress to keep judges from being unaccountable. I mean, there's all sorts of tools they gave to make sure we wouldn't have what we'd experienced with Great Britain. Well, we're right back now where we were 200 years ago with Great Britain. We've got lifetime appointments, unaccountable judges. And it's not because they didn't try, because they were prolific writers. It's not because they didn't put it in the Constitution. It's because we don't study that document anymore.
Wow.
We read about it in school, but we don't read it. Right. You know, we'll read somebody say, oh, the Constitution provides 3 co-equal branches. Well, let's read the Constitution and see if it does.
Right.
See, what we do is we take somebody's summary of it and we don't read it. So, the federal Constitution says that judges do not hold lifetime appointments. Article 3, Section 1 says they're appointed for the duration of good behavior. That's different. That means as long as you act right, you can stay on the court. If you act wrong, you're gone. There was no branch that was unaccountable to the people. That's why the Constitution up top says, we the people. We're in charge of all 3 branches. We don't have the divine right of judges like they had the divine right of kings. We do today. I mean, whatever the judge says. I was on a debate recently with a very high-ranking national media individual who's over a large media conglomerate. He says, well, if you guys don't like this decision of the U.S. Supreme Court, just go pass the constitutional amendment. And I said, no, wait a minute. If I have to change the Constitution to change the Supreme Court decision, you're telling me that their decision is the equivalent of the U.S. Constitution. Because if I had to change the Constitution to change their decision, then you're saying their decision is the Constitution.
Right.
See, people buy that.
Right.
People look at it. No, Founding Fathers gave us a lot of ways to change judicial decisions without having to amend the Constitution. We need to go back and read what Founding Fathers said about judges. Founding Fathers said they are not 3 co-equal branches. They said judiciary is the weakest, is to be controlled by the other 2. They said that judges do not have lifetime appointments. They specifically said we do not have 3 independent branches. None of the branches are independent. All the branches account to the people.